What if the reason so many high-achieving, high-functioning adults feel exhausted isn't because they need more confidence, but because they've lost clarity about who they are? Welcome to Centered, Becoming Whole in a Chaotic World. This is a podcast about orientation, integration, and the lifelong work of becoming whole. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, a Ph.D. exercise physiologist with a deep interest in the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. In this episode, we explore the growing identity crisis beneath modern burnout culture. My guest is Dr. Eric Moyer, Ph.D. in educational psychology and author of Redeeming Identity. Dr. Moyer argues that we've treated identity like open source software, believing we can boost or identify our way to a better version of ourselves at will. Instead of flourishing, many of us are experiencing what he calls a total system crash. Today, we'll unpack why building self-esteem without a rooted identity is like attempting a 3,000-piece puzzle without the picture on the box, and what it actually takes to build a life that holds together over time. Why do you believe our modern self-esteem movement, while it may be very well-intentioned, has contributed to our instability rather than our resilience?
Oh, self-esteem. I was a teacher. Whenever I was a teacher, that was the big deal. Was everything was about self-esteem. Grades were about self-esteem, and that's a great example in this. Is everyone knows at this point or have heard the idea of grade inflation? Is that everyone expects to get an A at this point? Well, that's a component of the issue of self-esteem. Self-esteem, just by the nature of it, is something that comes from who we are and the realization of our own successes. So self-esteem, the problem that we have with it is that it is many times validated. What we're looking for is we're looking for constant validation. And the validation comes from the outside. And so what you end up having is if you have someone who has really low self-esteem, you've probably heard the research around this. People with low self-esteem, they end up getting depression, they can have anxiety, they can have all of these different issues from a mental health status. And we, many times in our performance culture, think that, okay, great, the opposite must be really awesome, having high self-esteem. Well, the problem with that is that super high self-esteem can end up with a very hyper self-focus, which leads to narcissism. And you also end up having a lot of people who have very high self-esteem that end up having anxiety as well, trying to maintain that high self-esteem. And sometimes they even get into a trying to remember the term right now, imposter syndrome, where they're trying to constantly keep that high self-esteem, but they always feel like they're faking it. And so whenever I've talked with people about self-esteem, I use the term that I would rather not be in either of those two places. I like saying what I want people to be is I want people to be humble. I don't know if you've heard the term. The term, it has a lot of religious connotations, but many people think humble is like, oh, I'm down on myself. No, that's not really what it's supposed to be. Humility in its real definition is an honest evaluation, an honest understanding of who you are. And so I think that that's where we want people to be, is to really get a good understanding of who they are. What are their strengths? What are they really good at? What is the things that they have talents for, drives towards, that they can really do well? What are the things that they may not be as strong at, but they could continue to grow, they could continue to develop, they continue to improve in those areas. But instead of trying to think that they always have to be attaining and successful in every single area of their life, be honest about who they are. And I think that that's a much more healthy place to be.
And I think that's where, we talk a lot on this podcast, and, I've taught it for years, that I like to put parentheses around extra and extraordinary, because, we can be in the most ordinary of circumstances, but if we have identity in that, and we
Mhm.
treasure what we do, and we see the big P purpose in doing that,
Right.
we can accomplish so much more. But I think so much of our society is driving us toward, we have to be celebrity. We have to be, how many likes am I getting on social media and all those
Oh,
types of
yeah.
things, rather than being focused on, how well am I doing the things I'm intended to do on this earth? That we're
Right.
all here created for a purpose.
Mhm.
Living that purpose, we don't have to live somebody else's purpose. We need to live ours as fully as possible.
Oh, absolutely. That is a big deal. I think probably one of the worst things that could have happened to our culture is the role of influencer. Because if you ask
Hmm.
how many teenagers, what is their goal in life? I want to be an influencer. Okay, you can be an influencer anywhere. I love the idea of extra in the ordinary, because you can be an influencer anywhere that you are. It doesn't mean, though, whenever people think they want to be an influencer, they want to be an influencer over hundreds of thousands of people. Well, that may, I mean, there's drawbacks of that. That if you ask those people, they're always having to be on display.
Right. And what's the significance in that level of, you might so-called influence hundreds of thousands of people, but what real influence are you having?
Hmm.
Whereas that the significance of the influence of affecting one life could be so much greater.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The other part I think that is interesting in that idea of influencer is so many times those people who are influenced, they're trying to become like the person that's the influencer. And I love what you said before. That's more than likely they were not created to be like that person. They were created to be who they are.
Right.
So instead of trying to become someone that you weren't supposed to be, wouldn't it be better to figure out who you were meant to be and then and then learn to live into that? That's where you're going to find everything that you think you're trying to get, because by following that influencer, you're not going to find it that way. You're going to find it by trying to figure out who you were meant to be and living out of that.
So you use an analogy of a 3,000 piece puzzle without a picture on the box. And I do 1,000 piece puzzles, and I'm dependent upon that picture on the box. But what is the picture that most people are missing?
Oh, the picture that most people are missing is in, but I put it this way. I take it back to the origins. So and mine has my book has a very Christian perspective on this. And so the origin of what we were created for and the purpose that you said is we were created for a purpose. And the main purpose that we were created for was to be image bearers of God. And the challenge is through the fall of man, basically we lost that relationship with God. So because we lost that relationship with God, we don't have that picture, that image that we were supposed to reflect, we were supposed to bear. And so we're going through life looking for who we were meant to be, and we're grasping at these pieces and trying to figure out how they put together. And and on top of not having the picture, there are pieces from other puzzles that are being given to us that we're never supposed to fit into our puzzle. But we don't know that because we're not we were never we don't have that relationship to focus on who we were meant to be. But that's the whole idea of redeeming identity, is that there was a way for us to have that relationship restored. But once that relationship is restored, then we can then really start figuring out who is God. That's really the first question. And based on that, who were we meant to be? how were we supposed to reflect him in the unique way that we were created to?
I love that. And honestly, that is a concept that doesn't have to be tied strictly to religion. I mean, if you just think of
Mhm.
spiritual in its most raw sense, where it's, you're just a part of something greater than yourself,
Yeah.
then what is that greater than self? What is that image
Yeah.
of the greater than self? And how do I fit into this?
Oh yeah, that was the idea of Viktor Frankl
Hmm.
in his book about purpose, is that we were all meant for a purpose, and I think that that's a big piece of that. And many times it comes from having a perspective without us at the center, but that there is something bigger than us. And in my book, it's God, but in other spiritual disciplines, it they do go to other spiritual ideas, but it's that idea that there is a spiritual reality outside of us, a bigger thing that we were meant to be a part of.
And I favor, when I write God anymore, I will use kind of the small caps, so
Mhm.
similar to how Lord is written in the Christian Old Testament,
Yeah.
to signify that my concept of God is small relative to the reality of God. And it
Mm.
kind of, to me, keeps me a little bit more humble in my faith that, you know, I don't have all the answers, and we
Oh, right.
all have a different perspective of God, and we're all working toward kind of accomplishing that, moving in that direction. And
Mhm.
I kind of favor, if you've ever heard of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, he's a Jesuit priest and paleontologist. He came up with the concept of the omega point, and just thinking, that we are spiritually evolving toward this unity, this greater community, this greater love, what I would identify as God,
Mhm.
and so I think it's important that we understand how our identity, how our personhood fits into that whole bigger picture, whether we, profess a faith or not. I mean,
Mhm.
it's there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to what I said earlier. A lot of times our identity, whenever we really start talking about identity, it's moving beyond the labels that we put on things, but it's
Hmm.
really having the understanding of what is the meaning that we put onto those labels. It's what does that mean on the core of who we are and the inside of who we are. And in the book, the framework that I give that is I basically say, and is that our identity is made up of four components, four aspects, which makes up who we are. And they are the principles, the perspectives, the purposes, and the priorities. So if you take those four things, this is the core of who you are. And it doesn't get changed just by adding a label on. It's the question of what does that really mean? And how does that then relate to what do we do? How do we see things? What is our priorities? And so it's the those four P's, the principles, perspectives, purposes, and priorities that really then help us define and really have a greater understanding of whenever I say, this is who I am, it's not saying I am this because this is what I've done, but it's recognizing that I chose those things because there is something inside of me that said that that was important.
So let's kind of go to three other P's that aren't included in that. And how does identity differ from personality, preference, and performance?
Okay, that's a great question. Well, preference, I think, really is incorporated in those four P's. That's kind of why I tried to think about the things that end up dealing with us. Preference is really about what do we like to do. It goes to our priorities. It's what is important to me, what is not important to me. How do I make decisions? And so usually our preferences is kind of goes along with our priorities. So it's like what am I if I had to choose between doing this and doing this, I'm going to go this direction because this is my priority or my preference, which if you want to use that terminology. Performance, I think, also is incorporated into those four P's. I think that's where we get into purpose. It's our motivation. Why do we do things? It's that bigger. Whenever I think about purpose, it's like I said, the Viktor Frankl purpose. It's that, what is that bigger thing that gets me up in the morning and tells me this is what I'm focused on. This is what I'm going to be doing. You're a university professor. I've been a teacher in all of our lives. There's a reason why we went into fields where we teach, and we're about education. We're about helping people grow, change, develop. And and education is something that is many times very others focused. And there's something around our purpose, our internal purpose, our internal motivation that drives us to do that. But that also then leads to our performance, because if I'm living into my purpose, then my performance is going to align to that. Many times, though, whenever people are doing something but it's really not aligned to a purpose, then that's where a lot of times performance is not there. Personality, that's the one that I think is an interesting one, because there's so many aspects of personality that I kind of let that be a little bit separate from identity, in the sense that I think it could be an aspect of it, but there's so much research in personality, and that I didn't kind of want to incorporate that into identity, but I think it does have aspects of it. Personality is kind of like, how do we kind of show up in ourselves? It's like, are you an introvert or are you an extrovert? Are you a optimist or are you a pessimist? Do you see things? And that can be sometimes a little bit in the perspective side. So sometimes I think the way that personality shows up is a little bit more in our understanding from an identity side, and how we see things, our perspectives, which also then goes to our priorities somewhat. How do we define things? Do we define things as, if you're someone who's extremely anxious, then many times the way that you have defined things is that things are very scary. Things are very, you're living in a world that you see things as very much against you, rather than seeing another person who is not as anxious, sees things as everything as an adventure that's ahead of them.
And can some of that come from a bit of a disconnect from, identity going into those different parameters that, if we perceive our identity somewhat incorrectly, or
Mhm.
we look at like performance, if I fail at something, then I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, when sometimes failure in itself is part
Right.
of our identity. It's enabling us to grow because
Mhm.
we're learning from that failure.
Absolutely. I think it is part of I think the way that we deal with adversity, deal with struggles, deal with challenges, it does say a lot about our identity. It says a lot about our perspectives on things. You just said it there. It's, how do we see struggles? How do we see challenges? How do we see failures? I think Maxwell is the one that wrote the book Failing Forward. I think
I think so,
he's one of
yeah.
those. And his perspective is that whenever you fail, whenever something isn't going right, it's not that that's a failure, and so you have to take that personally, and that you're a failure, which is how some people are taught. That's the way that they are raised, and with the definition is that failure on your side means that that's who you are. That's the definition, rather than failure is an opportunity to learn about how something didn't work and what can be done differently. My wife loves the story of Edison and the light bulb, where I don't know if you've heard that one before, but it's like he tried to create the light bulb, and he tried like 1,000 different ways before he found the one that worked. And whenever he was asked about that, it's like, no, it's not that I failed 1,000 times. I just found 1,000 different ways that it didn't work until I came to the one that did. And
Yeah,
sometimes that's a great way to think about it.
I was going to say that's an important way to approach life. Is that failure? We're going to fail more times than we're quote unquote successful, but those failures are where we're learning. And
Absolutely.
Speaking of being an educator, I taught I still teach it, but it was a different institution when I first started teaching pathophysiology and exercise. I took the approach where I wanted the students to miss questions so that they would learn from it, because it was a mindset that, if you get all the questions right on an exam, I'm not really testing you for what you know, and you're not really learning from it. And, taking that approach, I had a bunch of educators at the university that were like, you can't do that. That's really damaging to, the student's self-esteem. As we were talking about self-esteem earlier, and I'm like, really? But then I had a student once who, she was one of the best students in the class, and she comes up to me after class one day. It's like, what do I need to do to improve my grades in here? And I was like, what are you talking about? You have like one of the highest grades in the class. She said, yeah, but I'm getting C's. And I said, no, you're not. I curved the exams. You're actually one of the top in the class. And she said, but you don't understand. I don't get C's. It's like, okay, relax. You're not getting a C, but I want you to learn. And I had a professor in anatomy that I don't know how I got through, my 3 years of anatomy in my Ph.D. program, because they were all oral exams, and Dr. Moyer would come in and he would just grill us on what we had been dissecting that week. And he had a knack for knowing what you didn't know. And he would ask you those questions. And I'm like, how am I getting A's in this class? Because I got every question wrong. And it wasn't until I got to my comprehensive exams, and as a PhD, you understand those, right? Your oral comprehensive exams. And I'd asked him, well, what should I focus on in preparation? He's like, well, just focus on the things you missed on the written part of the exam, which I hadn't missed that much. But so I focused on those, come in, he asked me those questions, got them right. And he starts asking me questions, getting further and further away from what I really studied. And then the last question he asked me was something I would not have studied. It was like, if you make an incision through the abdominal wall, what layers would you encounter from superficial to deep? I'm like, oh my, okay, well, think about it. You studied the skin. And I worked my way through, and he's like, wow, I didn't expect you to get all that. I'm done. And a friend of mine afterwards was like, do you realize that you just aced your comprehensive exams? And I'm not the brightest person in the world. I'm a good student, and that's how I got a PhD. But I realized that I learned how to know and learn and think my way through things. And failure helps us to grow into and understand what we are, are trying to accomplish. And there has been no growth in knowledge from people just memorizing what people already know.
One of the best definitions, and I would love to claim this as my own, but I will always give this away to Summit. But the best definitions for learning was positive struggle.
Yeah.
If you're not struggling, if you're not being challenged, if you're not in a way even having little moments of failure, doesn't have to be big moments of failure, but even just little moments where you have to stop and say, I don't know that. You're not learning, because you need to have something that stretches the boundaries of what you know, or creates a cognitive dissonance, which I love that term. Cognitive dissonance between what you think you know and what is really true. Because that's when you have to learn. You have to engage, and you have to struggle with that and let it create those in the brain, as you know, those mental maps, those pathways in the brain that are new, that then is what creates the neural networks that create those memories and creates the way that we think. but it takes that positive struggle. It takes those stretching. It's like, I mean, you do, from what you said, it's like a muscle. For a muscle to grow, it has to tear a little bit for it
Yep.
to then build new muscle. The same thing is true in our brains. We have to have that positive struggle.
And I think it's across the board. It's like spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. All of those dimensions
Absolutely.
require struggle. And, when you hear people say, well, if God's a loving God, how can he make us suffer? Well, first of all, he's not making us suffer. We suffer on our own accord. But that suffering is there for our growth. I mean,
Oh
one of the
yeah.
things that gives me the most optimism right now in our society is that I have that hope of the spiritual evolution that, right now, because I also studied geology as an undergrad. How I got from geology to exercise physiology is a whole nother story. But, thinking of like a fault line, the tension builds up before that fault slips. But when that
Mhm.
fault slips, there's destruction and there's a lot of, force going into that. But it's what creates, we wouldn't have the beautiful mountains and landscapes and
Mhm.
stuff we had if it wasn't for the tension in our, tectonic plates and everything as they're sliding. And so the tension in life is what brings the beauty forward. And I think right
Right.
now we might be in a state of tremendous tension in the world. But if we act accordingly, some beautiful stuff will come out of it. And I'm confident
Oh,
of that.
absolutely. It is it's that tension, like you said, the struggle. Going back to the Bible, which I think is just is a source of wisdom. It says that be thankful for those times when we struggle, and people read that. It's like, you want us to be thankful for the times that we struggle. Yeah, because that is the moment that bring forth patience, and then that out of that patience comes hope, and out of that hope comes peace, and out of that peace comes love. So it's that the struggle is there to help us see those places, and this is kind of where I take that with identity, is those places where within our own identity we have a piece of who we are that doesn't line up with reality, doesn't line up with who we were supposed to be. So sometimes we need to be willing to let something go so that it can be replaced with something better.
I like being uncomfortable in group settings, where you're kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. And, you have that back and forth, but you can always, at the end of the day, you can, shake hands, you can, have a beer together,
Absolutely.
whatever it might be. It's like you should be able to disagree, even contentiously, but still do so with respect and with an understanding of moving toward better understanding of yourselves and of the world.
Right. And I think that that is such a lost art, a lost understanding in community. I think many times, whenever we've created our communities, we've created these self-protecting, self-replicating communities rather than these communities that really help us grow and challenge us in different ways.
If you could leave the audience with just one guiding principle for redeeming identity and preventing burnout, what would it be?
The thing I always tell people is the focus should be on who we are, not what we do. Because if we become who we were meant to be, what we do is going to come out of that just naturally. It's like I was just up at Mount Vernon yesterday, and we saw all these wonderful gardens in Mount Vernon. They have these amazing trees that have been growing in Mount Vernon for hundreds of years. And they have apple trees and plum trees, and they've been treating the grounds and making sure that the trees grow well. The idea, though, of a tree is that it produces good fruit. And if there is not good fruit coming off of the tree, it's not because the fruit is bad, it's that there's something wrong at the roots. There's something wrong with the tree. And so I always encourage people to focus on who they are. Focus if there's an anxiety, if there is discouragement, if there's something going on, start asking the question of who am I? Or who have I allowed myself to become? What are those priorities and purposes that I'm allowing to dictate my life? Because if those have gone askew, who I am has gone a little bit off, that's going to impact who I am, which then is going to impact what I'm doing. But if we can get who I am back in alignment with what I was meant for, then what I do will come from that. So that's kind of the key takeaway I always want to give people from the book.
It's profound words. And so, speaking of the book, where can our listeners and viewers learn more about your work? And more importantly, where can they find the book, Redeeming Identity?
Well, you can find the book almost anywhere. It is on Amazon. It is in Barnes & Noble. But if you want to find out more about my work with identity, I have a website. It's actually redeemingidentity.com. And you can I have articles. I have a podcast also that people can check into. And we talk a lot about different aspects of identity, as you can guess. But you can also check out the book and other things there. So thank you.
Right, we'll have links to that in the description notes. And this has been a great conversation to guide us down that path. So thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate the conversation. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep helping us redeem our identity and keep aging well.